Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth session in this semester's series on the idea of home. So having broached general, philosophical, literary and historical themes, we now turn to the fascinating issue of the homes of non-human animals. And one might here recall, for those of you who may have been here in our first session, that we talked about one definition of home found in the Oxford English Dictionary, which was this: the normal resting place or abode of an animal, a nesting site or structure. So this takes us into the theme of the non-human home. I am saddened to report that one of our advertised speakers, Dr. Mark Woods, Chair of the Department of Philosophy, is unable to be with us today. But we are nonetheless more than fortunate to have with us today two highly accomplished scientists from USD's College of Arts and Sciences. I do have to say that one of the great joys of our work in the Humanities Center is working so closely with science faculty here. We love having you here, and we're really grateful for the expertise and the time that you share with us. So thank you for that. So our two guests today, Geoffrey Morse is professor in the Department of Biology. He received his PhD from Harvard University and is a specialist in insect evolution, focusing on how ecological interactions, environmental conditions, and geographic distributions have secured the striking diversification of the insect world. His laboratory here at USD is currently involved in multiple projects designed to understand the rapid diversification of insect species that resulted in their becoming the dominant animal in almost all of the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. One of these projects is an NSF-funded collaboration focusing on the role that diverse ecological interactions with plants, fungi, bacteria, predators, and parasites have played in the diversification of the armored scale insects of tropical rainforests. Professor Morse, I believe, was one of our very first Illume lecturers in the very early days of the Humanities Center. This is probably about 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
So welcome back. Nathalie Reyns is Chair and Professor in the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences. She received her PhD in Marine Sciences from North Carolina State University. Dr. Reyns' research is centered on the dispersal and population dynamics of marine organisms and the implications of these processes for fisheries management and marine conservation. This research focuses on identifying the biological and physical factors that influence the transport and dispersal of marine organisms, their settlement dynamics, and recruitment to benthic habitats. I didn't know what the word benthic meant, I'm ashamed to say. I'm sure you all do here. Apparently
I'm going to define it later.
So will you?
Yeah, you don't have to share.
I won't. I will wait. You can wait for that. But I'll just say I learned something today.
Oh.
It just shows that you can learn something when you're past retirement age. Dr. Reyns has ongoing research projects investigating a range of topics, including examining larval distributions and settlement dynamics in local rocky intertidal environments. She also examines invasive species in Mission Bay here in San Diego. I am very excited to hear our guests' thoughts on non-human homes. So please welcome Geoff Morse, Nathalie Reyns.
Thank you, Dr. Clack. I'm excited to talk about these non-human homes, and I think this discussion started last semester when I helped Dr. Clack and Dr. O'Shea on a field trip in Death Valley, and he started talking about his ideas for the fall, and I got really excited about, but animals do really crazy things. You have to learn about this. As I think many of my USD students do, I started this reflection with a Google search. And I think I just searched non-human homes to try to see what would come up. This is the first website that popped up, so 10 stunning homes not built by humans. And I'm never sure with these lists if number 10 is the best or number 1 is the best, but it started with 10, so I'll go in that order. But it included bagworm log cabins. So these are moth larvae that incorporate twigs and sticks as a structure. Caddisfly submarines, so these are also larval stages that live in water but use pebbles and sand grains and things like that to also make a structure. Ovenbird, adobe abodes, so they use little mud pellets to make their nests. Bowerbird theme park, so bowerbirds make complex structures particularly to attract mates, and they often use really colorful objects that they find. Sociable weaver apartments, so again, birds that take grasses and twigs and weave them into different compartments within a nest structure. Agglutinated foraminifera tests, I was actually surprised that this was on here. So my 1, 2, 3 students have just learned about protists, but I won't quiz them about this right now. But forams are protists, single-celled protists, and these particularly live in the deep sea. And they actually use the shell material of other organisms to create a test or shell structure around their bodies. Prairie dog gigacities. So prairie dogs can actually build, they build tunnels underground. Those tunnels house families and extensions that can have hundreds of prairie dogs living in them, and they can extend over thousands of square miles, which is amazing. They have chambers for rearing their young, so they call them nurseries. They have chambers where they might listen for sounds for potential threats or predators, so they can be quite extensive. Termite mega skyscrapers. It's hard to tell from this scale that you can see the trees in the back, but termites can build structures that might exceed 10 feet, so taller than a human. Ant empires, so big ant colonies, again, tunnels underground, with specialized areas where the colony might work together. And the last are bee 3D printing, is what they called it, but obviously beehives, which are very beautiful structures, very symmetrical and really interesting to look at. To me, what was interesting about this is that these descriptions were very humanized. So they used familiar human constructs to describe various structures built by animals. And so it's true that using these human constructs serve as a great teaching tool and might jog your memory when you think back on these different structures and these different organisms. But it's important to note that as biologists, we don't necessarily think of homes in the same way, and certainly not considering these human-built structures. So today we are going to talk about what is an animal home, and I have those in quotation marks. And you might be thinking about it from the context of domesticated animals. When I see this diagram with the dog, I think of my dog, who tends to think that my bed is her home and not the doghouse. But you can see the variety of homes that we associate with animals. I'm going to talk about how animals find home. And I realize in putting this picture up that for some of the younger students here, this might have no meaning. But you can talk to me about that later if you don't understand that context. And then we're going to talk about, primarily Dr. Morse will talk about the scales of animal homes. So this shows, the picture here are the migratory patterns for Arctic terns, which undergo some of the largest migrations on the planet. And then, of course, we're going to also talk about how we might be shifting animal homes because of climate change. And this shows an animation of how temperature is changing relative to a baseline from about a 50-year period. And you can see it'll continue. We have really robust temperature measurements that show that the atmosphere is warming, the oceans are warming, and land is warming, and that has consequences for our animal homes. So, here we go. Okay, so when we think about the human perspective, and I know this has been discussed in previous sessions as part of this series, but home is generally considered a place of emotional belonging, security, comfort, familiarity. And again, when I turn to a Google search about home, it seems like this kind of imagery is what, is what pops up. So families hanging out together in a living space with cozy blankets. I was surprised to see that no one had a phone in their hand. It's very different, I think, than most family homes. But also someone hanging out in their nice cozy stocking feet and the nice fire, hot warm drinks, and we even might define our space with home by these letters that you can buy at home decorating stores. But really, I think the commonality is that homes imply stability, resources, safety, that kind of thing. And so let's talk about it from the animal perspective. I'm going to talk about it from the ecological perspective, and I like to define what ecology means. I am an ecologist, and I think Dr. Morse and I have similar probably perspectives and biases with regard to this because of our ecological training. But the word ecology stems from the Greek word oikos, which means house, and logy is the study of the house. And it makes me wonder, although this is probably something better discussed among philosophers, whether home is the same thing as a house, because I don't know that it is. But regardless, as an ecologist, what I do is examine how organisms interact with one another, so the biotic components, and how they interact with their environment, or the abiotic components. And so we are looking at all of those things together. And one of the classic examples we use in class is this diagram, which shows different bird species, warblers, living in a spruce. And if you look carefully, the different colors on the spruce indicate where the birds actually live within the tree. So the birds are partitioning themselves based on slight differences on what they eat and whether they're inside the tree versus outside of the tree, where temperature and conditions might be slightly different. And so when we think about organisms or animals, we're really thinking about their ecological niches. And that relates to how those organisms function in the environment. So it's the interactions with the environment, but what their role is in the environment as well. So I'm going to be thinking and talking about things in this context today. So we define ecological niches as areas where organisms get protection from predators and or physical conditions. So they have defense mechanisms, they have special adaptations. We think of the need for provisions, so they need food, they need water, they might need space, they need shelter. And for an organism to be successful, it has to reproduce and actually pass on its genetic material. And so for some organisms that have really high parental care, that might mean having spaces where young are reared, like in rookeries or nurseries, or situations where animals might stay with their young for a long time to make sure that they actually survive. And so that's sort of on one extreme. And the other extreme are organisms with absolutely low parental care. And I study crustaceans, so I have to show my obligatory crab photo. And with crabs, this is an example of a female with eggs, but those eggs will hatch into larvae that develop far away from the mother, the female, in the ocean environment. And as the larvae develop and go through their life cycle, they will eventually complete development and return back to the similar habitat that the female originated from. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But the point of this is that ecological niches change. They change with development for many organisms. And so it's sometimes hard to define what an animal home might be. So I'm a marine ecologist, and so I study things in the ocean, and one of the questions that I like to think about is how do animals find home? And especially when you look at this image of the ocean, at first glance, you can see that the ocean is vast. On large scales, it might actually look very featureless. Certainly, no directional cues are provided. So how do animals find their way around? And so I'm going to give you some examples, one from a very large-scale perspective and one from a smaller scale perspective that ties into my research. some animals travel really far from home. And this is an example of some data collected looking at loggerhead sea turtles. And I know you don't see a sea turtle on this image yet. The tracks that you see are actually satellite tracks. So people who research these movement patterns of sea turtles will often put satellite tags on the tops of the turtle shells, and then those satellite tags relay positional information, so latitude and longitude, and then you can track how far they go. And what we know, so if you don't recognize this ocean, this is the North Pacific Ocean. So we are located here in Southern California, and over here is where these loggerhead sea turtles nest, so off the coast of Japan. And the females lay eggs in a nest, so they dig in the sand, make a nest. They lay those eggs, which develop for a few months in the sand, and then those sea turtles have to hatch out of those eggs and crawl back to the ocean. And once they get into the ocean, they travel to these foraging grounds that are in the central and sort of North Pacific, but eastern side of the ocean basin over here. And they spend decades eating and growing before they have to migrate all the way back to those nesting areas when they become sexually mature to complete the life cycle. And so they're traveling tens of thousands of kilometers. And the question is, how the heck do they do that? This is a really big area. And this has actually been studied quite well. So interestingly, in biology, we call this homing behavior. So there's a nice connection with the home there as well that I hadn't even thought about as I was typing it. And then I was like, wait a minute, that's interesting. So this is a loggerhead sea turtle. And as they are moving in the water, they're using a number of different environmental cues that you can think of as roadmaps to direct them to where they need to go. So it starts at the very beginning when those sea turtle hatchlings come out of the nest. They look for lighter areas, and if they're on a dark beach, the ocean tends to be lighter because of moonlight reflecting on the surface than land. And this is where human impacts can become a problem if we have lighted beach areas. But so they're initially looking for the light and moving out to the ocean, at which point they start swimming. And interestingly, loggerhead sea turtles have magnetite particles in their head, and it's thought that they're using cues from the Earth's magnetic field, which varies with latitude, and so that can actually help them position themselves geographically. And much like a compass that we might use, they're using that to help direct their movement. They're also very tied to temperature cues because they don't have a way to regulate their body temperatures, so too cold is not good. And of course, food is important as well. So all of those things work together, those environmental cues, to direct the turtles and serve as a map. And there's some evidence that as sea turtles get closer to being back near their nesting habitats, that they might actually use landmarks. So they might actually recognize maybe underwater features, whether it be a reef environment or a sandbank or features on land as well. So pretty complex and pretty remarkable ways to navigate towards home. So now let me give you another example. This comes from my research. So this is my field site, which is near Bird Rock in La Jolla, looking down into the rocky intertidal. And if I zoom in, this shows you where I spend a lot of time. And this is what it looks like at first glance. Maybe not so exciting, definitely not a coral reef with lots of sea turtles swimming around. And if I zoom in further, you can see the animals that I study, which are barnacles. And this is a close-up view. And so each little circle that you see is an individual barnacle. And they basically spend their lives attached to a rock or to a substrate. And so they don't necessarily travel far. They're not traveling as far as sea turtles, for sure. Some do travel far, but not by their own volition, because there are examples of barnacles that live on gray whales. those are thought to be commensal relationships. And then there are also even weirder examples of barnacles that castrate crabs. So they're parasites that prevent reproduction. And so they are moving more, but because they're attached to something else. Today, I want to focus on organisms that have dispersive larvae, so barnacles fall into this category. This is imagery from an article, a journal, actually a special session. There was lots of special sessions in a conference that then went into this journal publication, and the imagery, as you can see, the photos are quite beautiful. That shows you the diversity of larval phases, both marine fishes and marine invertebrates. And one of the messages here is that most marine fishes and invertebrates have this, what we call two-phase life cycle, where, this is for Professor Clack, benthic animals. So where adults are associated with the bottom, actually release larvae that then develop in the plankton. And actually one of the questions about that ecologists asks and evolutionary biologists asks are, why the heck would you release your babies into this environment where they go far away and you have no idea if they're going to make it back to where they should be, where you are, where you know that there's lots of food and there's space and shelter and everything that you need. And so larvae develop in the plankton. That word plankton also comes from a Greek word planktos, which means to wander. And so historically the idea was that, or the thought was that these larvae would go in the plankton and they would just wander around or drift with the ocean currents and then land wherever they landed. And the process of that development and then return to the adult habitat is what we call dispersal, and is what I study. I study larval dispersal, but basically we're trying to ask, how do they get home? What happens along the way? And so I'm going to try to describe that for at least barnacles, which we've studied really, really well. So how do animals find home? I like to show this photo because this is a photo of the underwater environment at my study site. It's not so nice, as you can see. It's very turbid. This area is in about 6 to 10 feet of water. It's in about the first 20 to 30 feet from shore. It's where all the waves are breaking. It's hard to tell, but there's lots of particles in the water. There's seagrass bits and other algal bits that are moving around because the currents are swirling around. And we get in the water. This is a photo that I took of my research technician. We're pushing these nets around because we're trying to figure out where the larvae are in the water, so what depth, and where relative to shore to figure out how they get home. So that's one of the things I spend a lot of time doing, is trying to figure out where the larvae are and where are they in the water. We also do it from boats, so we don't spend all of our time diving in really awful water. But we also spend a lot of time pumping water, and this shows my general sampling scheme where we sample close to shore, which is here, and we basically do a transect going from shore to offshore, and then we sample at different depths in the water, which is what those yellow squares refer to. So we're trying to understand what depths are the larvae in and how far from shore are they, because that can tell us something about how they get back to shore or how they go further away. And a number of papers have been published with my graduate students looking at these questions. And so I'm going to summarize pictorially what we know about this process. So with barnacles, the adults are on shore in the rocky intertidal habitat. They release larvae called nauplii that go into the surface water and get pushed pretty far away from shore, like within a kilometer or so. And they stay pretty close to the surface, which is also where phytoplankton or the photosynthetic plankton are, which the nauplii feed upon. And so it makes sense that the nauplii stay near the surface where they have their good food sources. And the nauplii continue to grow, and as they grow, they actually metamorphose to this late larval stage called the cyprid, which looks really different. And the cyprid stops feeding. So now it's just using its energy stores that it has gained during larval development to power the final leg of its larval life. And what we find is that those cyprids actually move deeper into the water, which is where it's colder. And eventually those cyprids are the ones to make the transition from offshore back to onshore to complete the larval life cycle. And so I'm going to make this a little bit more realistic and add some colors, because one thing we know about the ocean and what we've measured is that the ocean is stratified, which means that it's layered based on differences in temperature. And you may have experienced this yourself if you've ever been swimming in the water and you're near the surface and it feels kind of warm, and then maybe you dive down, or your feet are in water that feels much colder, or maybe even a little colder. Or you dive down to get something and you're like, ooh, it's a lot colder down there. You've just experienced a change in temperature called a thermocline, and those differences in temperature create layers or differences in density that actually power the way currents move. So currents move in different directions because of this stratification. And so we know that the cyprids are near the bottom. Near the bottom, currents can propagate towards shore. And by being in cold water, those cyprids are probably conserving their energy stores, because if they were in warmer water, they would burn through that energy faster. And so that's how they complete that life cycle. And then that's not the end, though. That's not finding home all the way, right? They've gotten to shore, but now they actually have to find a suitable settlement habitat. And so this is an actual photo of what a cyprid looks like. So you can see they have swimming appendages. The little circles that you see in their body are the lipid stores, or little oil globules that actually help power them. That gives them their energy. And then as they get closer to shore, they actually will use antennules, and they start feeling around, which is amazing to me that they do this, because these are microscopic organisms at the power and whim. They're experiencing the power of the waves breaking, and they're at the whim of the currents moving around as they're trying to do this. So they use those antennules, and when they find a suitable habitat, they will then metamorphose to a little baby barnacle. This photo is a photo that I took of some newly settled barnacles. So for scale, this is a bee tag. So these are little tags that are used to glue onto honeybees and other insects to track them. And I use them for a totally different purpose. But I glue them to rocks, and then it allows me to find the rock and find the barnacle and go back and track them and measure them and see how they grow over time. For scale, these lines right here, each line is 1 millimeter. So these are really, really small. And this process of settlement, we know from a lot of really cool studies that it's all determined by the chemistry, so chemical cues that might be given off by the adults that live in the area, or the microbiotic films that develop from some bacterial communities and other organisms that settle on the rocks, that they're using physical cues that include things like turbulence, changes in temperature, changes in salinity, changes in light, and all of that guides them to where they need to settle, which is usually in little divots and little cracks and crevices in rocks. And then, of course, survival depends on those physical conditions. It depends on the biotic interactions with the other organisms. And so we take advantage of that by knowing where they settle, by deploying these plates, and that we know that the barnacles will settle on these little cracks. In fact, I have a plate here because every week I go out and collect them. And we can get long-term measurements of how many baby barnacles settle, which gives us information about how many larvae are in the water, under what environmental conditions they might be coming in. And we've published some work on that and how this is linked to El Nino conditions or marine heat wave conditions. So environmental cues, environmental conditions are really important for this. And I will finish up by just saying that I go out and I measure larvae, but a lot of people are now turning to molecular tools, which are very, very powerful. This is a study in Belize looking at the connectivity of different reef environments, so all these areas with these stars, and basically trying to understand how gobies, so these little coral reef fish, how their larvae get transported amongst the reefs. And the idea behind it, if you look at the ocean currents in this area, you'll see that the ocean currents move in every direction. And so the null hypothesis is that you should have mixing of larvae from all of these different reefs to these different areas because of the way that the currents are. And when we look at the molecular data, these are microsatellite structure clusters. And really the only thing you need to know about this is to look at the colors, and you'll see how there are different groups of colors which reflect different clusters of genetic makeup, is how you can think of it. And so essentially what this is showing is that even on scales where we think that organisms are dispersing and moving around, they're actually not really moving as far as we think they are. And that's really cool when we think of how small these organisms are. So my take-home messages are that larvae don't necessarily disperse as far as we predict. They're not passive particles. Larval behavior actually controls how they travel and where they go and where they end up, which again is amazing to think about when we think of how small they are. And importantly, animals use a series of environmental cues and conditions to guide them to their homes. And that's also what allows us to define their niches. And of course, as humans, we are impacting all of that. We're impacting how we define these homes and what happens to them. And Dr. Morse is going to talk more about that next. All right.
All right, thank you, Natalie. That was great. And you're going to see a lot of overlap in our ideas here. So I'm going to be talking about the idea of home, I think maybe a little bit more, I don't know, philosophically or something for non-human animals. And then I'm going to bring that around to what we consider home and ask us to kind of broaden that definition and think more inclusively about the rest of the world around us. All right, so we've had a lot of discussion about the idea of home, right? I mean, Brian mentioned this. He went through some of his definitions. And, you know, home is where you live. It's your house. It's your apartment, your condo. It's a place we feel most comfortable, loved, at ease, protected, right? Professor or Nathalie mentioned that one as well. It's a place where you can be yourself and have a sense of belonging. This very often has a strong emotional context. If you were here for the very first introduction of this, Dr. Mayer talked about how sense can really bring us back to our youth and home, and you know, and all of the emotions that are associated with that. But then, how do we apply this? I hit the wrong button. I'm shining a. Yeah, that's what I was doing. Okay, how do we apply this to animals that aren't us? Right? How do we apply this concept that is hyper emotional to things that aren't us? And I think it's probably easiest to anthropomorphize domestic pets, right? Anthropomorphize is to attribute human characteristics or behavior to something non-human. I mean, our home is their home. We make our home in their home, perhaps, right? So, you know, we have some equivalency here. It's easy. And I say this because in my LLC Genomes and Evolution class, in introductions, I always ask my students to list their favorite animal. And a good 75 to 80% of them say like their dog or their cat. The other 25% are usually dolphins or tigers, right, Natalie? Natalie's doing my LLC class. So, you know, that makes sense. Now, how do we move beyond that, though? Are there other animals, right, in situations where we can fit some of those definitions? Well, you know, I think immediately we turn to that idea that that Professor Reyns talked about with that. You do the Google search, and they give us, you know, nests, right? You might be familiar with wood stork nests if you've ever been to Europe, and they're all over the place. This is an orange oriole, very similar to the weaver nests that were mentioned earlier. These are some nesting barn swallows. You may be modestly familiar with those guys. So we might think of like nests. It's constructed space. It seems comfortable. They seem protected. They seem to belong there. We might take this to things other than birds as well, where we have things that might make dens. So you might have, foxes or polar bears making their dens, or let's go a little bit less charismatic, a little less fuzzy, and go to a little den made for a weta. This is an endemic New Zealand cricket, about the size of my hand. I guess that's my wife's hand. We have the same ring. Her fingernails are longer. It makes a nice little den, and it goes back there. It goes out at night, and it feeds on whatever it feeds on, and it comes back during the day, and it makes its place there. So those they remind us of homes, right? Maybe the things that more closely relate to us for home are these multi-generational permanent structures. The prairie dogs that were mentioned previously, or maybe a beaver lodge, right? Or these are lesser mongooses that have taken over a termite mound, and they've occupied the same termite mound for as families and multi-general families for 2 decades, right? So, charismatic megafauna, it's kind of easy to go with them and define them. But there are other things, of course, that make nests that maybe it's also easy. The three-dimensional printed bee here. These are ants that have constructed their nest. These are weaver ants. They've taken their larvae out, and their larvae produce silk, and they say, okay, larvae, we're going to take your silk, and we're going to stitch together some leaves, and then we're going to make that our house. Right? So pretty amazing little things. We've all seen a wasp nest. They might make a tailpipe of a dune buggy into their house and construct their three-dimensional nest there. Right? So we can envision this. We can say that we now know what animal homes are. Right? But I kind of want to turn away from that, right? Home is a place where you can be yourself and have a sense of belonging. These are waved albatrosses on the Galapagos, and they are awkward, man. These are on their nesting grounds, right? All of those things that we just looked at, it's like it was linked to reproduction. It was linked to this is where you have your kids. But most things, like, that's a short-term kind of thing, right? These albatrosses that are doing this incredibly awkward behavior are only doing that so that they can, sit on their chicks' heads and until their chicks are able to fly away. And they will spend 9 months of the year on the wing out over the ocean. Where is their home? Is their home that place where they're laying their eggs and making a nest, where they trip seriously, they fall down on a regular basis? Or this place where they are just majestic and beautiful, where they belong? Right? So we might want to reconsider our notion of a home. Like, if we have our notion of a home as some constructed multi-generational space, then what do we do about things that don't do that at all? Right? We talk about home on the range, right? Where the deer and the antelope play, and there's no constructed multi-general space. They're moving around constantly. How do we find that home? I would say these animals all belong here. And so maybe we open this up a little bit, right? How do we apply this concept to animals that don't have anything approaching a domicile? So I want to return more to the sense of belonging and how we go about defining that as biologists, right? We can gather data to describe the things that allow organisms to thrive in their environment, allow them to have a home. Right? Now, you've already heard this, right? The ecological niche. Niche actually comes from an old French word meaning nest or to nest. So we've already got this idea that there's this space, this sense of belonging in our vocabulary now that we use to try and define these things. So it's a concept that attempts to define the things that govern where an organism lives. Right? Or another way to say that, it's a concept that allows us to understand where an animal belongs. All right? And so, this includes the physical aspects of its environment. So right here, you've got this cool dung-rolling beetle. These are only found in the very eastern Cape of South Africa in sand dunes. And then some of the offshore islands, they're flightless. That's the only place that they are. They really love elephant dung. It's their favorite to roll. So let's think about the physical environment. What kind of aspects of its physical environment might be super important for defining where this animal belongs? Any ideas? What might they care about? Temperature, humidity. Right? And I mean, that's immediately where I go to. Temperature, humidity, rainfall, fluctuation in temperature, diurnal and nocturnal patterns, annual temperatures, climate. Right? Climate can really define home. I mean, for other things, like it might be the pH of the water, it might be the minerals in the soil, it might be, whether they're on clay or sand, right? A lot of things like this. It also might include the other organisms with which it interacts, right? So, what kinds of things might this need? Think of this little beetle here. What does it need in order to have a home, in order to belong? Yeah, it needs elephants or other things. It needs dung, right? But there are other things that might want to eat it that define where it lives, things that might want to parasitize it. It might actually need a particular microbiome in its gut to help it digest these things. So all of these define an animal's niche, both the physical and the biotic. Now, we can actually apply these concepts to us. So if we apply these concepts to us, we can actually see that our niche looks something like this. It's tropical, right? This is from the Okavango Delta in Botswana. So we can do that, and we can actually look at some of our origins. These are all of archaic humans. These are all of our fossil origins. You'll note that they occur in the tropics and into the subtropics of Africa. We are a tropical species, right? And so if we look at that, we don't actually come out of the tropics until we figure out how to make our home tropical, until we start building fire, about 100,000 years ago, until we start wearing clothing, about 40,000 years ago, until we start constructing spaces. Right? And that allows us to spread out over the globe. And I'm going to return to this idea a little bit later. But we're tropical species. And if you don't believe me, try doing this for more than a few minutes. All right? If you're in Polar Bear Club, if you like going to do ice dips, try doing that for a living. Try doing that for more than about an hour. You will die. We are tropical organisms. We are not Arctic foxes. We are not polar bears. We do not have the physiological capacity to deal with this, right? You could take this and maybe make some money by developing a show around that. Okay, but I digress. We'll move on from that. I'm going to return now to non-human animals, right? So if we take this perspective, we can define home as belonging, as the things that are sufficient to sustain an animal through its life and through the lives of its descendants. Right, you've heard that already, so it involves reproduction. So if we look at these wildebeest, the wildebeest home is, right, they're never in one place. They're in a constant migration. In a single year, they will migrate as much as 1,600 kilometers, never stopping for all that long. They'll feed on what's there, and then they'll move. They'll follow the rains. You might say that their home is this massive plain that's a 1,600 kilometer trek. Right? So we could even go even further than that. Here's a blue whale off the coast of San Diego here. And here's what blue whales do. They move from up along Vancouver Island down to where they calf, down along in the tropics, and then they move back. So in a given year, they're going to range up to 12,000 kilometers. So to a blue whale, a 12,000 kilometer round trip journey is its home, right? That's where it belongs. That's where it survives. Now, I'm not a mammologist, despite everything that I've talked about here. I'm an entomologist. And so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here because my research explicitly focuses on things that are tiny, that can make their living across a very, very, very small home. And while you might think, like, what's the point of that, right? Blue whales, zebras, right? Those are cool. It's very remote from our existence, right? But it turns out that the vast majority of things that we share this planet fit this category. Most things are actually tiny. There's a great book by a friend and colleague of mine named Peter Skrecki who wrote The Smaller Majority, talking about this numerically, biomass, diversity. Little things dominate. We don't. Right? So that's what I'm going to look at. And little things, they can occupy smaller niches. And so I'm going to stick with charismatic things to begin with here. This is a Rocky Mountain pika, just incredibly, incredibly cute. Right? My daughter saw me making this talk, and she said, "Oh, can I get one of those?" And I'm like, well, it would die down here because they live exclusively at high altitude, montane, rocky outcroppings. They spend about 8 to 9 months of the year in a burrow. The rest of the time they are feeding, they're mating, they're raising their young, and that's it. Their niche is very narrowly defined. And one individual Rocky Mountain pika can be found in one of these places, and that's it. It's not going to range across these. Offspring will disperse away. They're like, oh, I got to get over to that ridge right over there. And they'll go, but they won't go far. If they drop down to where the temperatures are too high, they will actually die. Right? So they have these very limited ranges. This is a salt marsh sparrow. Their home is defined by spending their summers and their breeding grounds up in New England, and their winters down around the Gulf and the Atlantic coast in the south. Right? So their homes are in two different places, and their homes have to be intact in order for them to do this. Right? Very narrowly defined homes. They have to have salt marshes in order to breed. And they have to live in salt marshes in order to feed in the summer. Right? We can look at this yet again. This is a Kangaroo Island dunnart. I'm really narrowing in here. This is only found on this island off of the south coast of South Australia. And these are all of the known populations of the Kangaroo Island dunnart. It's a little marsupial, so it's in the same group as like koalas and kangaroos. It has its offspring in a pouch, where it eats little invertebrates in a coastal heath habitat, which is really, really, really limited in this area. Right? So we can go even smaller than this to like things that I work on. Right? So we can look at a dung beetle, which I introduced you to earlier. A dung beetle's home can really be defined on the things that allow it to survive from one generation to the next and therefore thrive. And so you can see some of these fun guys they're collecting some fresh zebra dung. The one at the top is rolling tapir dung in the Brazilian Amazon. And what they are going to do is they are going to bury these. They are going to lay an egg in a hollow chamber there on a little pedestal. And that egg is going to hatch, and it's going to eat and consume that dung, and it's going to emerge as an adult. It's going to come out. It's going to try and find another piece of dung where it will mate, and it will start this process all over again. That is their home. Right? This is my specialty. I'm like a world expert on seed beetles. Their entire existence, their entire niche is a seed of a plant. Right? So a female comes about, she emerges from a seed and she finds another one, puts her eggs on it. The eggs go through the larval cycle, and then they chew their way out as adults and they start this whole thing over again. They oftentimes don't even feed on anything as adults. Their home, the place where they belong, is a seed, and they are incredibly specialized. So one of these species is going to feed on just one species of plant. Not all of them. I, of course, have a picture of one of the very few ones that feeds on a lot of them, but regardless. So that very, very, very narrow range. And I'm going to take you even further to my other study organism, which are armored scale insects, which Professor Clack mentioned a little bit ago. They can't even move. Right? This is an adult female right here. I have pulled her scale off. She has no eyes. She has no antenna. She has no legs. She has glued herself to a plant, and she grows little mouth parts that form like hypodermic needles, and she sucks out the content of individual plant cells. That is her home. That's her life. It's incredibly, incredibly narrow. Imagine that. Contrast that in a blue whale in how we're trying to define these homes. It's pretty extreme here. But there's a reason I'm doing this, right? The fact that all of these animals have such little homes allows them to not only exist across very narrow niches and survive in those very narrow niches, but it also allows lots of them to coexist, right? And so this is a famous diagram in my field, at least, from Quentin Wheeler, 1990, where the drawing is proportional to the diversity of the species. So here's insects right here. Here's mammals, right? We're not all that impressive. Mice, spiders, scorpions, they do pretty well. Little things are super diverse. They are everywhere. All right, so why did I, introduce you, since I work on tiny little things that are insects, why did I introduce you to these three beasts? Oops, sorry. Sorry, there was something else that I wanted to say. No, there's not. So why did I introduce you to these? Why did I introduce you to the Rocky Mountain pika, to the salt marsh sparrow, and to the Kangaroo Island dunnart? Right, that's going to bring me to my kind of more general conclusion here on how we need to define home. Right, because we only got one of them. Right, we can define home more broadly, and we should define home more broadly because at a real macro scale, we all share a single home. Right, our biosphere that we live in is composed of interconnected ecosystems, or home systems, if we use that root of oikos. Right? This gets a long ways away from our emotional and personal definition of home, but I really think it's worth considering, right? Because we as a species have worked incredibly, incredibly hard to make the entire globe tropical. Right? This is a really cool map from World Maps that shows the density of human populations as a function of latitude. And so we move away. We find our comfort zones now outside of the tropics. Right? The fact that we now wear clothes and we live in houses, right? And we burn fire in a really, really, really extensive level. We put a ton of energy into being able to not be limited to the tropics, but still be tropical, right? So we put a lot of energy into that, and that has some serious consequences, right? This comes with very serious consequences for everything around us, right? And so why did I introduce you to the Rocky Mountain pika? Well, this is a simulation of what is going to happen to the Rocky Mountain pika's range with increased temperatures that are predicted. Right? If you're a Rocky Mountain pika and you live at the tallest mountain, and it gets warmer, and you go up to the top, and then you're at the very top, and it keeps getting warmer, where are you going to go? Extinct. Right? We lose them. This is a graph of the average Australian temperature, which shows a lot of fluctuation. But the trend is increasingly warmer. Right? I think we all have that sensation here in California as well. Right? Australia keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And in 2019 to 2020, there were wildfires in Australia that burned an area larger than England, the country of England, including essentially all of Kangaroo Island. Like, map these Dunnart homes onto where the fires were. And the fires aren't even done here. The fires continued moving eastward. Right? The Dunnart, they were afraid it was going to go extinct. They managed to find some remnant populations that made it in Goalies and Chase Flinders National Park and here in this region. But it's still incredibly threatened because, like, all of the cats that were rendered homeless in the fires really like catching them some Dunnart. So they're still in trouble. But, you know, the fires are burning. And how about salt marsh sparrows? Salt marsh sparrows build their nests in salt marshes. This is a graph of the average storm surge height as a function of time coming up to the present. And with increased storm surges, because of increased climate change and because of rising sea temperatures, this is what is happening to salt marsh sparrow nests, right? That is an egg underwater. It will not hatch. These are nestlings that are barely able to keep their head above water, right? They are limited in where they can go. They are specialized. They have a home that is very, very narrowly defined, right? And so if these like kind of things, I show you these because they're fuzzy and they're cute and we care about them. What about all of these other things? This is a velvet worm, an onychophoran, a really unique lineage, only in the southern hemisphere. This species was only found on one mountaintop in Australia, and its entire habitat burned. It hasn't been seen since. This is a high mountain Rocky Mountain spider that coexists with Rocky Mountain pikas. Like, it's on its way as well. We have this snail, which coexists in salt marshes and needs to lay its eggs in dry areas. It's also highly threatened, right? For every one of those really cute, charismatic, fuzzy things, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of non-fuzzy, tiny little things that also call that area their home that are also being lost that way, right? It's estimated in those wildfires, as many as 3 billion mammals, birds, reptiles, and frogs died. 3 billion. Imagine how many insects and snails and velvet worms perished. Species that maybe were never known, right? I'm actually working on 7 new species from Australia of seed beetle that no one's ever seen before, right? So, when you're tiny and the specs of your home are equally tiny, right, minor changes or disruptions in your niche can be really impactful. In fact, they can be devastating. So the consequences of climate change can do that. And you might say, like, so what? They're just insects. They're bitey, they're buggy. I don't like those. I think we need to take a more inclusive view of home, right? We can actually ask, if we lose insects, do we survive? This is the amount of our food that is a direct consequence of insect pollination, right? So we might not even survive if we lose those things. Even if we do survive, we want to ask the question, what is the quality of life that we are getting in our home, right? Are we doing to the world what the people of Rapa Nui or Easter Island did to theirs, right? This was a diverse, palm-covered island when humans arrived. It was rapidly deforested, in part by humans and in part by the rats that came along with them. And people survived, and they did it by figuring out how to cook those rats in 100 different ways. Seriously, that's the gourmet thing that you get on Rapa Nui is cooked rat. Now, and the people there are like, oh yeah, no, we're doing well. I get rats every day. It's great. But think of this as the quality of life and how you define your home. Right? We need to ask how this affects not just our survival, but the quality of that survival and how we define that home. So with that, right, we are the only species on this planet that can engage in a diverse series of conversations about what we call home. We are the only ones that can do that. So we also need to ask ourselves if we therefore have an ethical responsibility to consider the homes of those species out there that can't engage in this conversation. And maybe make our definition of home a little bit more inclusive, right, to those animals that we're so dramatically impacting. And with that, thank you.